Kansas Prairie, October 1879. A column of smoke rose 40 miles south, taller than any thunderhead these settlers had witnessed in their lives. The wind carrying it dragged the scent of burning blue stem straight toward the homesteads clustered along Salt Creek. Every soul in that valley stood outside, watching the black wall advance. Every one of them running the same grim arithmetic in their heads. How fast does a prairie fire travel when the wind is pushing it? How many minutes before it hits the fence lines? Would the fire breaks they plowed last spring hold against flames that travelers swore could leap 100 feet on a single gust? In the center of that valley stood a cabin unlike anything else in 3 counties. 3 of its 4 walls, solid, unbroken expanses of squared oak logs, were banked nearly to the eaves with packed sod and prairie earth. No window faced south, where the wind was bearing down. No window faced west, where the fire would strike first. No window faced east, where flames would sweep past on their march forward. Only the north wall held glass, the lee wall. The wall turned away from every punishment the plains could deliver. One small window of double-thick glass, sunk deep into timber, shuttered with iron-bound oak. The Hungarian widow who built that cabin stood in her yard, her 2 children beside her. She did not run. Her neighbors had called that cabin a tomb for 14 months. They said a house sealed on 3 sides was no house. It was a coffin standing upright. Dark, damp, unfit for civilized folk. They had laughed when she banked sod halfway up the walls, laughed harder when she planted nothing but cropped grass and bare dirt in a 30-foot ring around the structure. Now, those same neighbors were fleeing, and the widow was lighting her stove and setting a kettle on for coffee. What did this woman, from a country most of her neighbors could not locate on a map, understand about wind and fire and the failure of glass that the entire settlement had dismissed as the strange habits of a foreigner who simply did not know better? If this kind of story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. We have more accounts like this worth remembering. Drop your city and time in the comments. We love seeing where these stories travel. Ilona Vargas had reached Kansas in the spring of 1878. 2 children, 3 trunks, a small leather pouch of American dollars her late husband had converted from their savings before cholera claimed him in a Pennsylvania mill town. She was 34, broad through the shoulders from a girlhood spent turning hay on the great Hungarian plain they called the puszta. She moved with the steady deliberation of a woman who had already lost more than most people lose across an entire lifetime, and had decided she would not lose another thing if her hands could prevent it. Salt Creek was not her first choice. It was her last. The land came cheap because the previous claimant had abandoned it after the Prairie Fire of 1874 burned his soddy and killed 2 of his oxen. The railroad agent in Topeka told her straight. Any homesteader taking that quarter section needed to understand what fire could do on open plains. Ilona nodded at the agent, signed the papers. Where she came from, the puszta burned every dry summer. Sometimes lightning set it. Sometimes herders lit it deliberately, knowing fresh grass grew strongest where old grass had been scoured by flame. Her grandfather had built his charder, his roadhouse, on the open grassland east of Debrecen. Thick adobe walls, shutters that closed flush against the openings. The long blank face of the building aimed straight into the fire winds that came screaming out of the Carpathian foothills every August. She had grown up watching fires cross the puszta like fast-moving shadows. And she had grown up understanding something fundamental. Grassland fire was not the same creature as forest fire. Grassland fire moved with the wind. Grassland fire could be predicted. Prairie fire took the lives of those who raised their homes without reading the wind, without studying what the dry months demanded. Ilona's first summer on that claim, she did not build a cabin. She carved a sod dugout into the south face of a low ridge, and she lived there with her 2 children, 8-year-old Margaret and 5-year-old Paul, while she watched, while she listened, while she learned what the land was trying to tell her. She kept a notebook, small, leather-bound, the same kind her grandfather had carried in the old country. Every morning at dawn, every evening at sunset, she recorded the direction of the wind and its strength. She sought out anyone willing to speak with her about the fires that had swept through the valley before. An old freighter named Windowless, a man who had hauled supplies along Salt Creek since the late 60s, told her about the 1874 fire, the 1871 fire, the smaller burns that rolled through nearly every autumn when the grass dried to tinder and the south winds gathered force. He sketched a rough map on the back of a flour sack, marking the paths the worst fires had traveled. Ilona copied it into her notebook with care. The pattern revealed itself plainly. 3 of every 4 devastating fires in the Salt Creek Valley roared up from the south or southwest. Hot, dry winds born in the high plains of Texas, gaining muscle as they crossed Oklahoma, slamming north into Kansas. The 4th dangerous fire typically arrived from the west, a cold front pushing through, a backing wind hurling flames eastward across brittle grass. Almost no fire of consequence had ever descended from the north. The north brought rain. The north brought cold. The north was safety. By the time snow fell that first winter, Ilona had made her decision. She would build her cabin facing north. The only window would sit in the north wall, sheltered from every fire wind the plains could hurl at her. The south wall, the west wall, the east wall, solid timber banked with sod. No openings, none. Only the chimney rising through the roof and a narrow ventilation gap cut high beneath the eaves, screened with iron mesh. She would orient the long axis east to west. The narrow end would point south, presenting the smallest possible face to the fiercest winds. She would scrape a wide firebreak around the structure and keep it cropped to bare earth through every dry season. She told no one. She had learned in the Pennsylvania mill town that immigrants who explained too much made themselves targets. And she had learned in her dugout that summer that the Salt Creek settlers had no appetite for foreign reasoning. They wanted to see whether she would last a year. Most believed she would not. The women who arrived with bread and quiet pity in the autumn months made it plain. They expected to help her load her wagon back to Topeka by April. She did not load her wagon. In April of 1879, she hired Bertram Krause, a German carpenter from a neighboring township. She paid him in cash for 6 weeks of his labor. Krause was a deliberate man. He did what was asked. He posed few questions. When Ilona showed him her drawings, he studied them a long while, then nodded slowly. "Quote 0, he said in his thick accent. Ilona answered, "Quote 1. He nodded again and began measuring the foundation lines. They worked through May and into June, hauling oak logs from a stand of timber along the creek, squaring them with broadaxe and adze, fitting them into walls thicker than any walls in the valley. The cabin was small, 16 feet by 22 feet, but the walls ran nearly 10 inches thick, solid oak, dovetailed at the corners with the precision Krauss had carried from the old country. The neighbors began appearing in late May. The comments followed immediately. Hosea Tilbury, a tall, lean homesteader from Indiana who held the section directly south, rode up on his bay gelding. He sat watching Krauss notch a log for a quarter-hour without speaking. When he finally opened his mouth, it was to ask why the south wall had no windows marked out. Ilona set down the bucket of clay chinking and looked up at him. "Quote 2, she said. Tilbury turned this over in his mind a moment. Quote 3, quote 4, quote 5, quote 6, quote 7, quote 8. Tilbury shook his head and rode away without another word. But by the following Sunday at the small Methodist meeting house 3 miles down the creek, every settler in the valley had learned that the Hungarian widow was constructing a windowless box. Probably didn't know any better, they said, because women from the old countries had no understanding of how proper American homes were built. Phoebe Crowell, wife of the settlement's blacksmith, made a deliberate point of cornering Ilona after the service. She explained that proper American homes had windows on every wall, to let in light and air, to allow a housewife to watch her children playing in the yard. Ilona listened with patience, thanked Mrs. Crowell for her concern, went home, and continued building her cabin exactly as she had planned it. The second round of criticism arrived when she began banking the walls with sod. Bertram Krauss finished the timber work in the middle of June, and Ilona spent the following 3 weeks cutting sod from the prairie east of her claim, stacking it against the south, west, and east walls. She built the earthen layer to a height of nearly 6 feet, packed it dense, sloped the outer face so rain would shed away from the timber. By the time she finished, the lower 2/3 of the cabin resembled from the outside a low earthen bunker, only the upper logs and the shake roof rising above those green sod walls. Hosea Tilbury came by again to inspect the work. This time he brought his cousin, Royal Tilbury, and Royal's brother-in-law, a man named Mendel Crane. The 3 of them stood at the edge of Ilona's yard, watching her tamp sod against the western wall. After a long silence, Royal called out to ask what in tarnation she thought she was doing. Burying her own house. Ilona said, Royal said. Mendel Crane laughed at that. Hosea did not laugh, but he did not contradict his cousin either. They lingered another 5 minutes, offering commentary about how dampness from the sod would rot the logs, how worms and snakes would tunnel through the dirt and end up inside, how a proper Christian house was raised on a stone foundation to stay dry and clean, not heaped around with mud like a heathen mound. Ilona kept tamping sod, did not answer them. Eventually they rode off, shaking their heads. That night, she wrote in her notebook that the wall banking would accomplish 3 things. It would add thermal mass, keeping the cabin cool through summer, warm through winter. It would shield the bottom logs from direct flame contact during a grass fire, since sod itself would not burn. And it would protect the lower timber from the radiant heat that raced ahead of a fast-moving fire. Heat that could ignite dry wood from many feet away, even without flame touching it. Her grandfather had not used those precise words. He had not been an educated man, but he had known all 3 truths in his bones. He had taught them to her by walking her around the solder on the pusta, showing her the scorch marks on the upper walls, the unburned earthen banking below. The third wave of criticism came in late July,
when she cleared the firebreak.
Ilona had decided her cabin would sit at the center of a 30-foot ring of bare earth or close-cropped grass. No shrubs, no wood piles, no haystacks, no outbuildings within that perimeter. She borrowed a breaking plow from a neighbor named Olof Bierke, the only settler in the valley who had not yet spoken a cruel word about her cabin. And she spent 4 full days plowing furrows in concentric rings around the structure. Then she dragged the loosened earth smooth with a harrow section she had built herself from an old wagon axle and forged spikes Bertram Krause had made for her before he left. When she finished, her cabin stood at the center of what appeared to be a freshly turned garden plot. It was nothing of the sort. It was a defensive firebreak, engineered to starve any flame that came racing across open grass. The inner 10 feet she kept scraped to bare dirt. The outer 20 she allowed to regrow in low grass, cut tight to the soil every 2 weeks through the dry season. Her woodpile she relocated 70 feet east of the dwelling. Her chicken coop and the small barn for her milk cow she positioned on the sheltered side of a low ridge, 100 yards north, where any fire would need to climb uphill and spend its strength before reaching her animals. This was the change that finally drew open ridicule. Plowing firebreaks was common enough on the plains. Most settlers in the valley had turned at least 1 furrow around their homes. The careful ones had plowed 2 or 3, but no one had carved a 30-foot ring of naked earth. No one had stripped every scrap of fuel from inside that ring. And certainly no one had banished their woodpile and their barn to a separate location, far from the house they slept in. Hosea Tilbury rode past in early August and declared, loud enough for Ilona to hear, that the Hungarian woman had turned her claim into a battlefield. The cabin standing alone in a bare parade ground, like a fort bracing for an army that would never arrive. __quote, _13 _____, he called to her. Ilona straightened from the harrow she was dragging and weighed her answer. 14 months in this settlement had taught her something. Arguing with neighbors only drove them deeper into their positions. So she said nothing for a long stretch. Then she said, quote 16, quote 17, quote Tilbury repeated, quote 18, quote Tilbury scowled at this and rode off. Ilona returned to her work. She did not believe she was wasting a thing. She believed she was purchasing insurance. The premium, a few weeks of hard labor, and the loss of perhaps half an acre of grazing ground. The payout, if the worst arrived, would be the lives of her 2 children and the survival of everything she possessed in this world. The summer of 1879 came in hot and stayed dry. Rain fell only twice between mid-June and the end of August. Both were brief thunderstorms that laid the dust for a few hours before the wind baked everything brittle again. By the first week of September, the blue stem and the switchgrass and the side oats grama blanketing the open prairie had cured to the color of old straw. Cottonwood leaves along Salt Creek had begun yellowing weeks ahead of schedule. Wind blew steady out of the south nearly every afternoon. Hot, dry, carrying the faint smell of distant smoke, grass fires burning somewhere down in Indian Territory or the Texas Panhandle. Too far to threaten the valley directly, close enough to remind every soul living there that the season had come. Ilona completed her preparations and waited. She harvested her small garden, stored the vegetables in a root cellar dug into the same low rise as her original dugout.
Well away from the cabin.
She filled every barrel and bucket she owned with creek water and stationed them along the north wall beneath the single window, ready if she needed to soak blankets or wet down the sod banking. She kept her cow and chickens near the barn on the north ridge. She cleared the path between cabin and barn so it could be followed even in heavy smoke. And she made one final preparation that none of her neighbors knew about. She built a heavy plank shutter for her single window. On its outer face, she mounted a sheet of stamped tin, purchased from a peddler who had passed through the settlement in late August. The tin was meant for roofing. Ilona had cut it, folded it to fit the shutter exactly, and fastened it with copper tacks so it would not rust the iron hinges. That shutter could swing closed and lock from inside in under a minute. Once sealed, the tin face would throw radiant heat back from the glass it protected. She drilled the motion through September, timing each attempt with the small clock from the mantel. She made Margit and Paul rehearse until the 8-year-old girl could drop the bar into its iron brackets in fewer than 30 seconds. Then October arrived. The wind changed direction. Old Wendell Hossack came by on the 4th with a sack of cornmeal he'd hauled from the mill at Council Grove.
He stood in Ilona's yard a long while,
staring south. The sky wore a strange yellow tint. The smell of burning grass hung thicker than it had all summer. Hossack had been freighting across the plains for close to 20 years. He knew fire weather the way a sailor knows a coming storm. Quote 19. Quote, he said, his voice low. Quote 20. Ilona nodded. She had felt the same certainty deep in her bones since waking that morning. She thanked him for the cornmeal and offered coffee. He declined. Had to get back to his own place. Had to ready it as best he could. He studied her cabin, the sod-banked walls, the tin-faced shutter, the wide ring of scraped bare earth, and said,
Ilona said.
Hossack replied. He climbed onto his wagon and drove away. The fire arrived on the morning of October 9th. It started somewhere south of the Cimarron, perhaps a careless cooking fire at a freight camp, perhaps a bolt of dry lightning that had cracked through the ridge of high pressure 2 nights before. By the time the smoke column showed itself above the Salt Creek Valley, the head of the fire stretched 40 miles wide. It raced north at the speed of a galloping horse, pushed by a south wind that had gathered since dawn and now gusted 35 to 40 miles an hour. The settlers saw smoke around 10 in the morning. By 11, the column stood tall enough to throw shadow across half the sky. Ilona was in her yard, pumping water into the last of her barrels, when she spotted it. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, called Margit and Pal inside. Then she walked the full perimeter of her fire break, checked that no stray tumbleweed or cluster of dead grass had blown in overnight, pulled 2 small thistles near the south wall. She moved her cow and chickens into the barn on the north ridge and barred its door from outside. Walked back, climbed up onto the sod banking, inspected the roof and chimney one final time. Then she went inside and barred her own door behind her. The wind was a steady roar from the south now, hot, dry, carrying the first faint particles of ash. She stationed Margit at the iron stove, with instructions to keep a small fire burning for tea. The day would be long. They would need to drink. She placed Pal on a stool by the north window, watched the horizon, tell her if anything changed. She herself climbed onto a stool near the small ventilation gap by the south eave, and watched the smoke column advance. By noon, the column had become a wall. The leading edge reached the valley's southern horizon at 12:15. By 12:30, the air outside her cabin had dimmed to the brown murk of a heavy dust storm. The temperature, low 70s that morning, was climbing fast. Ilona felt it through the cracks around her south wall vent. She climbed down, went around the cabin once more, checked every gap, every seal, every preparation she had made. Then climbed back up and watched. A quarter-mile south, on the Tilbury claim, Hosea was running. He had seen the smoke when everyone else did. He'd spent the morning trying to pen his livestock and wet down his outbuildings with the small amount of water he had hauled from the creek at dawn. But Hosea Tilbury had not spent 14 months reading the wind and learning the shape of the terrain. He had not reinforced his cabin walls with packed sod. He had not scraped a 30-foot ring of naked ground around his home. What he had was a single furrow turned in a loose circle roughly 10 feet from his door. A woodpile leaned against the south wall of the cabin, convenient to the kitchen. 4 windows of single-pane glass sat in pine frames, 1 per wall, because that was how proper American houses were supposed to look. When the leading edge of the fire crossed the southern line of his claim at roughly 1:45 that afternoon, Hosea stood on his roof, gripping a wet blanket, swatting at embers already settling into his shake shingles. His wife Cordelia
and their 3 children
were inside. The flames at the fire's head rose 8 to 10 feet where the grass grew tallest. They moved at better than 15 miles per hour, faster than a man could sprint, faster than most horses could manage in blind terror. Hosea watched that wall of flame bearing down. He saw the heat shimmer, rolling out before it like a ghost. And he understood in one awful, crystalline instant that the blanket in his hands would save nothing.
What followed
would later be pieced together from Cordelia Tilbury's account, given to the Lyon County newspaper after the family was hauled by wagon to the small hospital in Emporia. The fire struck the south fence line of the Tilbury claim at roughly 10 minutes to 1. Radiant heat, racing ahead of visible flame, reached the south wall first. In under a minute, the temperature of the south-facing glass climbed past its breaking point. Single-pane glass in a pine frame was never built to endure radiant heat of any kind. A long, jagged crack split from upper sash to lower sill. Then the pane shattered inward, raining fragments across the kitchen table and the wooden floor. The moment that glass failed, the cabin's seal was broken. Embers and burning grass, already spinning through the air outside, now had a clear path inside. Cordelia was screaming for the children huddled in the back room. Hosea was scrambling off the roof, blankets still clutched in his fists.
Before he reached the door,
The curtains above the kitchen window caught from a single ember that drifted through the shattered pane. 30 seconds later, the curtains had lit the tablecloth. The tablecloth lit the rag rug beneath the table. The cabin was burning from the inside out. The west window failed at nearly the same instant as the south. The east window followed within 2 minutes. By the time Hosea pulled his family through the north door and into the thin fire break surrounding the structure, 3 of 4 windows were gone. His cabin burned from within while the prairie fire screamed past on its way north toward the rest of the settlement. The family lived because the same wind driving the flames also carried the worst heat beyond them, and because Hosea had enough presence of mind to press his wife and children flat against the bare earth of his single furrow and cover them with that wet blanket. But the cabin was a total loss inside 20 minutes. The fire took the woodpile. It took the small barn. It took the 2 horses he hadn't been able to free in time. Half a mile west, the Crowell place was burning the same way. Phoebe Crowell, who had once explained to Ilona that proper American homes required windows on every wall, watched her south window explode inward while she was dragging pots off the cookstove to hurl into the cellar. Her husband, the blacksmith Theodore Crowell, was at his forge 100 yards from the cabin when the fire arrived. He survived because he threw himself into the small stream behind the smithy and buried his face in mud while flames roared overhead. But the cabin burned, and Phoebe burned with it. She had gone back inside for the family Bible after the windows failed. A beam came down across the doorway and pinned her in the back room. Royal Tilbury's claim, 2 miles to the southwest, lay directly in the path of the fire's western flank. Royal hadn't banked his walls, hadn't cleared any firebreak worth the name. His cabin sat on a gentle rise where the previous owner had scraped the grass away with a hoe. But that clearing stretched no more than 15 feet in any direction, choked with dried weeds that had sprouted since the hoeing back in spring. The fire found his place around 1 in the afternoon. His south window gave way first, then the west. By the time the family ran for the root cellar, the inside of the cabin was already consumed. They survived, pressed together underground with damp blankets held against the wooden door. But when they crawled out after dark, there was no house, no barn, no chickens, no winter food. Mendel Crane fared worse. His cabin perched at the head of a shallow draw, a natural funnel the fire used like a throat. The wind compressed there, accelerated, and the flames struck his south wall before he could shut the door. His roof was burning before he could reach the back. His wife escaped through the north window. Mendel himself was caught in the doorway when the lintel overhead gave way. He was the only man killed in the settlement that day. But 2 children at separate homesteads also died that afternoon, both from smoke inhalation in cabins where windows had shattered and toxic air filled the rooms faster than families could flee. Ilona watched the fire approach her own claim through the narrow ventilation gap beneath her south eave. The leading edge crossed her southern boundary around 1:10 in the afternoon. She saw the wall of flame advance with the speed her grandfather had once described to her, a small child on his knee. A winter night in the village outside Debrecen. The grass at the edge of her clearing was the last thing to burn before the fire met the bare earth of her break. She saw flames climb perhaps 12 feet at the leading edge, saw them stretch and bend and try to leap the 30-foot gap. Embers flew by the thousands, glowing red against brown-black smoke. Some landed on the sod banking, some on bare earth. A few drifted down onto the shake roof. But the bulk of the fire struck her cleared break and starved. Without fuel, the flames collapsed within seconds. The radiant heat continued, blasting across bare ground, slamming into her south wall with a force that made the cabin's interior grow warm through 10 inches of oak. Ilona felt it on her face from her position at the eave gap. She climbed down fast, went to the north window where Pal still watched, made her son step back from the glass, pulled the iron-bound shutter closed, dropped the bar. For the next 40 minutes, fire raged past her cabin on both flanks. The eastern arm of the burn ran along her eastern fence line, and that heat struck her east wall almost as hard as the first blast had hit the south. but the east wall was solid timber backed by sod. No glass anywhere on it. No opening except the high ventilation gap she'd built, too narrow for any ember to pass through. The western flank moved past her west wall at roughly the same time. Same physics applied. Solid oak banked with sod, faced with no openings. The fire simply could not find a way in. The shake roof was the single real vulnerability, and Ilona had thought about that roof for months. She'd built it with shakes split from green oak, soaked and cured slowly so they'd resist ignition far longer than ordinary pine shingles. She'd laid them thicker than custom demanded, 3 full overlapping layers. And she'd raised the chimney high above the roof line, capped with heavy stone, a wide skirt of mortared rock sealed around its base. No flame could climb the chimney and ignite the shakes from within. As the fire swept past, she heard embers drumming on the roof above her. A few hissed and cracked against the shakes. But there was no deep sound of ignition. No smoke inside the cabin beyond the faint haze drifting through her ventilation gaps from the burning grass beyond. By 2 in the afternoon, the fire's head had pushed a mile north of her claim, still running fast. The air in her yard was starting to clear. The grass beyond her firebreak lay black from one edge of the world to the other, a continuous scar scorched into the earth. The temperature outside still held well past 100 degrees, but it was falling. The smoke was thinning. Ilona told Margaret to keep the children quiet and stay inside. She cracked the north shutter just enough to look out. And she looked out at a world that had remade itself in under 2 hours. The Tilbury cabin to the south was gone. Only the chimney remained, standing alone above a heap of blackened timbers, thin smoke still curling from the wreckage. To the west, the Crowell place, the same. To the southwest, the Crane place, the same. Across the entire valley, where 9 cabins had stood that morning, she could count 3 structures still upright. Hers was one of them. The other 2 were the Biaka place to the north, shielded by its position beyond a wide stretch of ploughed wheat field, and the small soddy belonging to a recent immigrant family named Eklund, which survived because sod does not burn. That family had never installed glass windows, making do with oiled paper that simply blew out in the heat without shattering, without leaving jagged openings for embers to crawl through. Ilona left her children inside and stepped out into the yard. The sod banking on her south wall was scorched black on its outer face, but the sod itself held firm. The timber behind it, unharmed. She walked the full perimeter of her firebreak, scanning for anything still smouldering. She found 2 spots where the cropped grass at the outer edge had caught, burned, and gone out on its own, small patches of black ash. She kicked dirt over them anyway, in case any heat lingered beneath. She checked the north ridge, found her barn intact, found her cow alive, wide-eyed, trembling, but breathing. She came back to the cabin and let her children out into the yard for the first time. She pumped fresh water from the well and washed their faces. Then she went to help her neighbors. The first person to reach her cabin was Olof Biaka, riding hard from the north on a lathered horse. He had seen the smoke from his own claim, had ridden the long way around the burn to check on her. And when he came over the last rise and saw her cabin standing, he reined up short, stared. The sod banking was black on the south side, the shake roof dark with soot, but the structure was whole. Ilona was standing in the yard with her 2 children. The milk cow was lowing in the barn on the ridge. "Bog Ivasa Meg," Björk muttered. Norwegian, not Hungarian, but the impulse to praise God was the same in both tongues. He swung down from his horse and walked toward her. "How?" "Come and see," Ilona said. She walked him slowly around the cabin, explained in the simplest terms her still imperfect English could manage what each element of the design had been built to do. The orientation, the blank south, west, and east walls, the single north window with its iron-bound, tin-faced shutter, the sod banking, the 30-foot fire break, the high ventilation gaps covered in iron mesh, the thick green oak shake roof, the chimney with its wide stone skirt. Björk listened without a word. He had spent more than a decade on these plains. He had seen prairie fires before. He had built his own cabin with windows on every wall, the way every other settler in the valley had built. He understood, standing there listening, that he had been building wrong, that the woman beside him, soot on her face, apron torn, had been building right. "How did you know?" he said finally. "My grandfather built like this," Ilona said, "on the pusta where I am from. The fires are the same." Björk nodded slowly. "We will rebuild," he said, "the valley. We will build the new cabins like yours. Some of them, perhaps. All of them, if I have anything to say about it." The other survivors started reaching her within the hour. Hosea Tilbury walked in, leading his wife and 3 children, every one of them coated black with soot, trembling so hard they could barely stand. Royal Tilbury rode up on a borrowed mule from the Björk claim. The Crane widow arrived in a wagon, driven by an older neighbor from past the fire's eastern boundary. Her face bone white beneath the ash, her eyes locked on something no one else could see. Theodore Crowell came alone, walking slow, because he had not yet located his wife's body in what remained of his cabin, because his mind had not yet accepted what his eyes already knew. Ilona took every one of them in. Her cabin measured only 16 by 22, but she pushed the table aside and spread blankets across the floor and stoked the iron stove high for tea and broth. She had packed her root cellar full against the chance of feeding her family through a brutal winter, and now she carried that food up in armloads to feed the people who had nowhere left to go. By dusk, 11 souls crowded her cabin, her own 2 children among them. They sat or lay on every surface that would hold a body. They said almost nothing. They ate what she placed before them and drank what she poured. Wendell Hossack pulled up late that evening in his wagon, having taken the long route around from his own claim, which had survived because he'd ploughed 3 rings of fire breaks the spring before. And because his cabin sat low in a draw, the fire had jumped clean over rather than pouring into. He brought 2 sacks of flour, a side of bacon, a small keg of whiskey. He set them on Ilona's table. He looked around at 11 exhausted faces in her cabin. He said nothing for a long time. Then he lowered himself across from Ilona and said, "You knew. I knew. You knew the whole time, and you let them mock you." Ilona considered this. What was I to say to them? They would not have listened. They had to see. Hossack stared into his cup. They have seen now. The settlement passed that night in silence and shock. The following day, riders came up from the railroad town to assess damage and deliver relief supplies. A representative of the territorial government arrived from Topeka the day after that to record names of the dead and the displaced. The death toll for the valley stood at 3. Phoebe Crowell, Mendel Crane, a child named Solomon Bjornstad, the 8-year-old son of a homesteader on the eastern edge of the burn, whose cabin had not been visible from Ilona's claim. His loss was not understood by the rest of the settlement until the following morning. 2 more children died of their burns and smoke-ravaged lungs over the next week, despite the doctor who rode out from Emporia and stayed 9 days tending the wounded. The total property loss, as the territorial government's representative recorded it, 6 cabins burned to bare ground, 3 more severely damaged, 2 barns destroyed, 4 root cellars collapsed, 15 head of cattle dead, 28 horses and mules dead, chickens and pigs beyond counting, gone. The Salt Creek settlement had been a community of 17 homesteads on the morning of October 9th. By the morning of October 10th, only 7 of those homesteads still had structures standing that a person could live in. 3 of those 7 were so badly damaged they would need rebuilding before winter arrived. Ilona Vargas's cabin sheltered the 11 people she had taken in for nearly 2 weeks, until survivors could be moved to relatives in other settlements or to temporary lodgings in the railroad town. During those 2 weeks, she fed them from her stores. She let them sleep on her floor. She drew water from her well for them. And she answered, over and over, the same question. How had she known to build her cabin the way she built it? She told them about her grandfather's tsada on the pusta. She told them about the long blank walls that faced the fire winds. She told them about the shutters and the banking and the cleared ground surrounding the structure. She told them that grassland fire was a different creature than forest fire, that grassland fire moved with the wind, that any house built on open plains needed to be shaped around the prevailing fire winds, not around the prettiness of windows on every wall. She did not lecture. She did not gloat. She answered when someone put a question to her, and then she returned to the work. By the time November snow blanketed the valley, rebuilding had started in full force. Olof Bjarke made it his mission to speak with every survivor still standing, every fresh arrival who rode into the valley to stake a claim on abandoned ground. He told them what he had witnessed at Ilona Vargas's cabin. He told them what it meant for the way every soul in that valley ought to build from now on. The German carpenter Bertram Krauss returned from his township. 3 separate families hired him to lay out new cabins following the Vargas pattern. Blank south, west, and east walls. A single north-facing window. Sod banking along the base. The fire break. The heavy shake roof. Not every family took every element. Some insisted on cutting at least one small window into the south wall for light and air, accepting the greater fire risk in exchange for that comfort. Some chose to bank only the south wall with sod because the labor of banking 3 sides was enormous and they would rather spend those hours behind a plow. Some built their fire breaks at 20 feet instead of 30 because their claims were narrow and losing grazing ground hurt them. But the core principle that a cabin should be designed first around the fire winds and only second around the comforts of ordinary life. That principle sank its roots into Salt Creek Valley in the autumn of 1879. And it held. The pattern spread beyond the immediate settlement in the years that followed. Wendell Hossack carried it along his freighting routes, describing it to settlers across 3 counties. Bertram Krauss taught it to apprentices and to other carpenters who came asking about the strange Hungarian-style cabin he kept building. The Björk family wrote letters to relatives in Iowa and Minnesota describing what they had seen. A few of those relatives already planning their own moves onto the plains, carried the design with them and raised variations on their own claims hundreds of miles to the north and east. By the middle of the 1880s, a recognizable pattern of fire-resistant prairie construction had taken shape across portions of central Kansas, Nebraska,
and Oklahoma.
People called it different things. Some named it the Beaker Cabin, after Olof Bjarke, who had championed it most loudly. Some called it the Hungarian Cabin, a vague nod to the immigrant origin that Olof himself always insisted on crediting. Some called it the Windwood Cabin, or the Dark Wall Cabin, or simply the Fire Cabin. The names shifted from mouth to mouth. The design remained fundamentally the same. Modern wildfire science would, more than a century later, validate every element of what Ilona Vargas had built in 1879. Single-pane glass fails at radiant temperatures between 250 and 300 degrees Fahrenheit, well below what the leading edge of a fast-moving grassland fire generates. Once the glass fails, the building envelope is breached. Embers and convective heat flood the interior faster than any human can respond. Solid walls without openings on the windward sides eliminate that vulnerability entirely. Sod banking adds thermal mass. It shields the lower portion of timber walls from radiant heat capable of igniting dry wood from many feet away. No direct flame contact required. Pleated fire breaks deny fuel to advancing flames, forcing them to spend energy crossing bare ground. Shutters, faced with reflective material, bounce radiant heat back away from the structure. Reflective coatings on exterior glazing have been demonstrated in modern testing to provide effective protection against radiant exposure, exactly as Ilona's tin-faced shutter accomplished with technology a full century older. None of these principles were unknown in 1879. Every herder on the Hungarian puszta knew them. Every settler on the Russian steppe knew them. Every farmer on the Australian outback knew them. The people who lived where grasslands burned had known these things for generations. What set Ilona Vargas apart was not that she possessed the knowledge, it was that she carried it across an ocean and applied it, stubbornly, without apology, in a place where the local population had not yet learned that grassland fire was its own breed of disaster, a disaster demanding its own kind of preparation. Ilona herself lived on her claim for another 26 years. She married the German carpenter Bertram Krauss late in her life. He'd been a widower for many years and had come back to the Salt Creek Valley in 1882 to raise cabins for a fresh wave of settlers. The ceremony was small, held at the rebuilt Methodist Meeting House. They lived together in the original cabin she'd constructed with her own hands, the one Krauss maintained and improved across the decades, but never changed in its bones.
Margaret grew up,
Married a railroad surveyor, moved to Topeka. Pal grew up, took over the family claim, expanded it through homestead acquisitions, and raised 6 children of his own in a larger version of that same fire-resistant cabin his mother had taught him to respect. Ilona died in 1905. She was 60 years old. They buried her in the small cemetery beside the meeting house, next to Krauss, who had gone before her by 2 years. Her gravestone, paid for by Pal and Margaret, was a simple block of granite. Her name, her dates, and at the bottom, a single Hungarian word, Megmaratunk. Pal had asked the stone carver to add it. The carver did not know what the word meant. He carved it carefully and exactly anyway. The word means, we endured. It is a word drawn from the long memory of the Hungarian people, a people who have endured many things across many centuries on a plain that catches fire every dry summer. It was the word Ilona carried with her across the ocean into the Kansas Prairie. Through the autumn of 1879, when her foreign ideas saved her family and began to save her neighbors. The cabin she built no longer stands. Her grandson replaced it in 1934 with a larger frame house. He used the original sod-banked walls as a foundation, but tore down the timber above them. The foundation remains visible, though, on a low rise near the ruins of the old Methodist meeting house. A small bronze plaque set into the ground beside it marks the spot as the site of the Vargas cabin. Placed in 1979 for the centennial of the Great Fire, the plaque reads in part, "Here stood the cabin of Ilona Vargas, immigrant from Hungary, whose foreign methods saved her family and many of her neighbors during the Prairie Fire of October 9th, 1879. She built 3 solid walls against the fire wind and 1 window facing safety. The lesson endures." And it does endure, in the bones of structures still standing across the Central Plains, in the design of fire-resistant homes in modern wildfire country, in the building codes of California and Oregon and Australia, where windows are now required to be tempered or shuttered against radiant heat, in the simple, durable principle that a builder who takes the trouble to ask which way the wind comes is a builder whose family is more likely to be alive when the fire passes. Ilona Vargas asked that question on a frozen morning in the spring of 1878, sitting in a sod dugout with her 2 small children. She kept asking it